Hey, Tim, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks for having me back on again. It's a pleasure.
There we go. That's the book. Let it be your guide. The Kansas album review. To cover this band, to cover any band the right way, you got to bring together people who know their stuff about the band. And you sure did that. Tell us who you talked to for the book. And what exactly is a weed head?
Well, I guess weed heads are same as, Sammy Hagar's fans are called redheads, and, Grateful Dead, deadheads, Trekkies. It's just a nickname for Kansas fans. They're from Kansas, a lot of wheat.
All right. And you talked to over 30 weed heads, right, for this book?
Yeah, I found a lot of them. Well, I did find a lot of them, but honestly, Eric, it took me some time. And it's one of the things that further reinforced why this band needs talked about more, because I had a really hard time finding enough people that could really speak to the band passionately and weren't, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this because everybody likes different things, but I ran into a lot of, well, I've got the best of, I really don't know much about them. I needed more so people that knew the catalog inside and out. So I'd done enough episodes of my own and on the Contrarians and on Sea of Tranquility. So I knew that I had a base to choose from. And if I met one fan, I'd ask them if they knew any others, and that would lead to, what I ended up with. But yeah, great assortment of people, anywhere from people that got into the band almost as soon as they started to people that just got into them a few years ago. I didn't discriminate because we can all hear a piece of music and then give our thoughts on it, right? And sometimes someone that's just newly introduced to an album may pick up things that someone has listened to it for 40 years would have. I never noticed that before. So yeah, got a great crew here.
Yeah, for me, it was great going back, listening to these albums, hearing songs that I never heard before, because I am that Kansas fan. I know the hits, but I needed to know more about the band. So listening to the songs that I knew of and just enjoying those all over again. And then discovering songs, Can I Tell You, which I think is their first single.
Yep.
And
that's a special song in their career. That's one that got them signed, and
yeah, Portrait, The Wall, Song for America is, that is just epic. So it was just great to listen to all these songs again and get people's input and the stories behind the songs, all that stuff. So it was a lot of fun. And this is what you write in the introduction. Kansas, they're a little bit prog, a dash of boogie, a hint of AOR, a smidgen of hard rock, and all excellence. But we're not talking about a band that's from a part of the world that churns out multi-platinum selling bands, right? I mean, this is talk about where they're from and specifically in Kansas, where they're from, and how did they end up landing a major record deal?
Well, so yeah, they came from like one of the most unlikely places to come out of, in the early 70s. I think they were based in Topeka, and Kansas was not a hotbed of anything. It's not like New York or Detroit or LA. There was no scene there, but that doesn't mean that you didn't have a lot of young musicians, listening to the radio and buying the same records and being fired up about making music, making their own music. So I think the combination of where they came from and the fact that they did have this affinity for everything from blues to early prog rock to a little bit of everything, it all informed their sound when they first started. And I don't think it's a sound that could have come out of anywhere else. There is something intrinsically American about Kansas as far as the classic prog bands go. A lot of it is the fact, you had Robbie Steinhardt's violin. It gave it that down home kind of feel to it. But at the same time, when they were prog, they were as prog as anyone. They could do the extended solos, the strange time signatures, the really complex riffs and passages that you just boggle their, and then you see that early live footage of them playing and they're so tight and they're just on it. And you're like, how do you get that good?
Yeah, right from the get-go. Yeah. Well, that's what's interesting too, is you think about all these hits, Carry On Wayward Son, Dust in the Wind, Point of No Return. And you think, well, these must have come from the first album, second album. Not the case. First two albums, it's a band that's on fire, but they don't have any hits until the third album. Which is
fourth album, actually. Yeah,
oh, you're right. The fourth.
Yeah, because they had two albums out in 75. So they're just pumping them out. But yeah, it wasn't until Left Overture when they had Carry On Wayward Son. And, it was make or break.
Yeah,
But go back and listen to those first three albums, and no, there aren't really any obvious singles, but the musicianship and there's still melody. There's still plenty of melodies. You just shake your head and go, man, these guys were just amazing. And I love the fact that they went through all of these different phases. Like I love their 80s sound. I love the fact they had an AOR uh period. And the last two albums that they've put out in 2016 and 2020 are two of their best ever. So it doesn't matter who's been in the band. They've always been a high level of, they've never really phoned in an album. And I think it's important for people to know this isn't a band that had a few albums out in the 70s and then went away, or they're just playing the circuit, playing the old 70s stuff. That is just not the case. This is a rich catalog of music, and it deserves. I wanted to give just as much time to the independently released albums as I did to the major label albums that sold millions.
which you did. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. We mentioned the song "Can I Tell You?" So that's the song that gets the attention of Don Kirshner, and that's a question that you posed to the panel. It's regarding that song. What is it that Kirshner heard in that song that got his attention? What do you think?
The violin was a little different. There were bands that were using violin. There weren't a lot of them. It definitely wasn't your average, you're putting a rock band together. Said, okay, we need a guitar player, maybe a couple guitar players. We need a bass player, drummer, singer. Maybe we need a keyboard player. Oh, and we got to have a violin player. That's not always an instrument that would be like a main instrument. It's not like, oh, you play a little violin. We might need that for a song or two, but not woven into the arrangements of the songs. So I think maybe he heard something. I think he just heard something different. But in my mind, that song is one of their simpler, and I say that with an asterisk, tunes from that period, because it was kind of straightforward compared to some of the stuff that was on the first album and some of the stuff that Kerry Livgren had been writing beforehand. What's significant about Can I Tell You? It's not a Kerry Livgren penned song, which is interesting because he wrote a lot of their early material himself. And it's interesting that Don Kirshner took an interest in them. I think that's just one of those wonderful coincidences, because this is the guy that the Monkees and the Archies. This is not someone you'd think would have an eye or an ear towards prog rock. And I would recommend for anybody that wants that full story, yes, I think you should buy the book. That would be fantastic. But they did a documentary in 2015 called Miracles Out of Nowhere, and it basically chronicles their career from the beginning through 1977. Very, very well explained how they got signed. And Kirshner, having that clout in the industry, he had his like a vanity label or a label named after him that was distributed by CBS. That's how Kansas ended up on CBS.
And a lot of people may be familiar with him through his TV show, Don Kirshner's Rock Concert. That was a famous show, well known.
Very important show in exposing groups that wouldn't otherwise be on mainstream TV. And much like when you hear people that grew up in the UK talk about the old grey whistle test, I think that Don Kirshner's Rock Concert served the same purpose, as did shows like the Midnight Special.
There was a question you brought up in the book, I think, and I wonder how much Jethro Tull had to do with his discovery of Kansas. And what I mean by that is, by that time, Aqualung had been a huge hit, and I think Thick as a Brick came out after that as well. And so we have Jethro Tull now, this band who's taking an instrument like the flute and incorporating into rock and roll, and it's working. Was maybe he looking for the American Jethro Tull with the with the violin instead of the flute?
I think there's a possibility that he said, you know what, whether or not I understand it, you've got Jethro Tull, yes, were huge at the time. Genesis were making inroads. They weren't gold, platinum selling at this point, but they were making inroads and they were doing well on the road. And I think maybe he thought, there's no American group like this. Wouldn't it be cool if I had the first one?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure that's what was going through his head. Yeah. And the lead track, Can I Tell You, is the lead track from the first album. So Song for America is the follow-up album. This is where we see that iconic Kansas logo on the cover.
One of my favorite logos.
Yeah, great logo. The title track is one of my favorites. And there's a great piece of trivia behind where this song was written, right? Is this the one that was written on an airplane?
Kerry
Livgren?
Livgren supposedly conceived this entire song while he was on an airplane and just looking over America. And but this is a 9-minute song with plenty of tempo changes and mood changes and chord changes. And the fact that he was able to come up with that in his head, he must have been able to write out music and had something, so that when he got somewhere near a recording studio or a tape recorder, he could get his ideas down. And I always joke about this, and I say this in a fan loving kind of way, but I've heard that Paul Stanley wrote Love Gun on a plane, and that's one of my favorite Kiss songs. But that's a little bit different than writing Song for America. Like, that's a lot to remember. I think Kerry Livgren was just one of these quiet geniuses, and he just very, he had these ideas, and it's like in that documentary I mentioned, you hear these different songs coming out of this guy, and it's just like, I'm just sitting next to him eating a burger. It's just Kerry. It's just he's got this big brain, and he's got these ideas for these songs that just don't sound like anybody else. It's pretty amazing, and that is one of the most complex songs. I'm not sure pound for pound if it's their most complex song, but it's pretty complicated song to think of when you're on a plane without a guitar, without a microphone, without a tape recorder, without anything to document where things are going to happen, and it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and again, the playlist of all these songs you can find on the show notes page. People should go and check it out and listen to that song. It's one of my top favorites. I would say Point of No Return is one, Dust in the Wind two. Maybe that one is three. That might be number three. And Kerry Livgren, by the way, was the keyboardist. We should mention what the lineup was in those early years, right? So we have Steve Walsh, lead vocals.
Yeah, well, Kerry Livgren played keyboards. He played guitar. I think he could play a multitude of instruments, and he composed on a multitude of instruments. Steve Walsh was the lead singer, but he also played really good keyboards. He was a great organ player. A lot of them were multitaskers. The two guys that are in the band that started recording that are still in the band now are Richard Williams, who's a guitar player. He's a guitar player with the eye patch. Phil Lehart on drums. Very, very underrated, overlooked drummer. He's one of the finest, classic rock drummers ever. And then you had Dave Hope on bass, and his bass lines were really, really good and really integral to the songs. He doesn't get enough credit. I think that's generally across the board. They don't get enough credit. Robbie Steinhardt had the violin, but he also co-sang with Steve Walsh, and Robbie had kind of a huskier, deeper voice, but it was perfect for the songs that he did the lead parts on. And Steve Walsh is just one of the greatest vocalists ever. I mean, millions and millions of people have enjoyed Wayward Son and Dust in the Wind. That's quite a voice. Well, there's a name behind that voice, and people need to know who it is and also what else he's done. So yeah, the original six-piece lineup of Kansas were, that was the lineup that was together from 74 through 1980. And in that time, they did, I think, 7 studio albums and a live album, and they were very prolific.
And his story with Kansas is interesting because he left, he came back. Reminds me of Bobby Kimball with Toto.
A little bit,
singer,
yeah.
left, came back.
There's some similarities there. He came back and he brought their new bass player with them, Billy Greer, because the two of them were in a band called Streets from 83 to 85. They had a couple of albums on Atlantic Records. And Billy's been with the band ever since 1985 or 1986.
That third album, Mask, from 75, you asked the panel if there was any connection to the songs with that album title, and there was a great response from Peter Jones. First, what is the meaning of the word mask? And do you recall what Peter's thoughts were on that?
Oh, Peter is a great panelist. He's a drummer. He's a musician in his own right, so he knows what he's talking about. And it's the idea of there's a bit of theater in there, and there's also a bit of putting on different masks, because within Kansas you do get a little bit of that Southern rock, even though they weren't strictly Southern geographically, but you do get a little bit of that Allman Brothers, Lynyrd Skynyrd sound. But you also get that Jethro Tull, that Yes sound. You can get some R&B there. So they could wear all these different, metaphorical masks, and still have this unified sound. It's a little bit like Queen, Queen album. You'd have songs sung by Roger Taylor, sung by Brian May. You'd have heavy songs, you'd have cabaret songs, you'd have rockabilly songs, and yet you knew instantly it was Queen. I think Kansas had that same sort of potency in their music. They had that signature where even if you've never heard it before, I said, well, that sounds like Kansas to me.
Carry On Wayward Son, a huge single, number 11. And then the album sells 5 million copies. So here we go. Finally, after 3 studio albums, all excellent studio albums, but finally they get that hit single. You say that without this song, Kansas could have ended up a band without a chance, and 4 albums would be all we would have heard. Kerry Livgren wrote it, offered it up to the band at the end of the recording sessions. We know the band was creating some amazing work prior to this, but what is it about this song that stands out from the others to where it finally reaches a wide audience?
It's kind of fascinating because we sometimes when you have a song that's lasted as long as that has and has gotten the airplay and has showed up in so many different media, you start to take it for granted. So I always try to be a picture like what would it have been like listening to the radio in '76, the first time you heard that a cappella opening and that drum lick and then that riff come in, and you're like, what is this? This is the coolest thing I've ever heard. And every part of that song is a hook. The guitar riff is a hook. The verses are catchy. Chorus is catchy. The solo's catchy. You can sing it. Every part of that song is a hook. And I just think it was something that people just couldn't resist. And how many times, Eric, in rock history have you heard about that, where a band's best known song or the song that gave them a career almost didn't make the album that it eventually appeared on? How many times has that happened? It's such a weird thing. You just never know what's going to connect with people. But I think one of the stranger things to me about Carry On Wayward Son is the fact that there's no violin on it. And that's what they were kind of known for. Like, oh, that's the band with the violin. There's not one trace of violin. And maybe it is because Kerry brought it in at the last minute and he hadn't worked out a violin part. I don't know. But it's one of those, what I call them a bulletproof song. In other words, as many times as I've heard it on the radio, I've never turned the channel when Wayward Son comes on. I listen to it all the way through. And, to me, that's like Tom Sawyer by Rush, or because it's like, yeah, okay, it's the one song they tend to play, but at least you're getting to hear your band on the radio.
I think there's something to be said too, that the song starts right away with that catchy hook, like Eric Clapton. It's in the way that you use it, right there. Yeah. So, you go back to those radio days.
Comparison. It just demands your attention. Right?
It demands your attention. And in those days of radio, it's like, is this listener going to want to listen or they're going to tune out? And so it's instant. So that probably has a lot to do with it as well. Yeah. And that's off of Left Overture.
Yeah.
Which the cover is so cool. Right.
Yeah. It's an amazing, and that's another thing that I love about this band. And it's one of the reasons why I loved beginning when I started collecting vinyls, because most of their album covers are art. They're not just a cool rock album cover. They're pieces of art.
Who does the artwork on that one?
A lot of their 70s stuff was done by, the first names have gone right out of my head. Drennan and Lloyd. I think Peter.
Let's see. I can look for
Drennan and Lloyd. Anyway, it's.
I don't see it in Wikipedia here.
Yeah, it's so embarrassing when I can't think of this stuff off the fly, and I should be able to.
So we can look it up. But my question is, and you asked this question, who is that guy? Who is that guy with a big old beard? And
well, if you go back to their first album, the first album has a pretty striking image on it, and it's a painting called "Tragic Prelude" by a guy named John Stewart Curry, and John Brown is the man with the beard at the forefront of that picture. And he was a famous abolitionist. And that painting is on a mural in the Kansas State Building. And Phil Ehart saw that at an early age, and he always knew if he had a band, he wanted that to be his first album cover. And they've used that old man imagery different times. He's on the cover of their best of, he's on the cover of their box set. So I've often wondered if that guy on Left Overture is a kind of a frazzled looking John Brown. I don't know. It might also be a self, it might be a reflection of Carey, the guy that, hey, write us some songs. So he's straining, trying to write the next masterpiece, right? And the notes are flying, away from him. I love the colors. I've always just really, even before I was into the band, I remember I would see that cassette in like the $5, the cheaper cassette bins, and I'd always think that was a cool cover.
Was it Peter Lloyd? Did he? Because he
Peter
did the
Lloyd
next one.
and Drennan. The last name is Drennan on the other. Yeah, it's definitely
Okay.
Peter Lloyd.
Well, Peter Lloyd does the next album, which is my favorite album musically and my favorite cover.
It's another stunning
point of no return. Yeah, point of no return from
I
77.
like the back. I think the back cover is great. I love the inner sleeve where it looks like the old map and the lyrics are
just gorgeous.
written in calligraphy. Just amazing stuff. And you lose that today in the thumbnail era.
Yeah. Yeah, just a gorgeous piece of work. And my favorite album, as I mentioned, as far as the songs, released October of 77. We got the title track, Dust in the Wind, huge. The title track went to number 28, Dust in the Wind, number 6. As for Dust in the Wind, there is one part in the book where you talk about how the band was asked by the label to come up with a hit, and they came up short. I don't believe that was the case here. I mean, this wasn't something, this just happened, right? Can you talk about how this song was written? Just a finger exercise for.
My understanding is that Kerry Livgren was sitting with an acoustic guitar and just doing that opening lick. And his wife said, hey, that's nice. You should make a song out of that. And he said, oh, no, this is just a fingering exercise. And it went on to become their, one of their 2 signature songs. And I think I understand why that song resonates with so many people, because I think everybody's felt like that at one time or another, that sense of hopelessness, and you're just a small drop in a big ocean. And, ultimately, all your money won't another minute buy, material things mean nothing, right? But I think it just it resonated with people. And also the fact that it could get played on so many different formats at that time, right? And it certainly brought them to a newer, hey, maybe they were the first rock band to have an acoustic ballad be their biggest song. I don't know.
Right. Yeah, that was like like Extreme with more than words.
Big or yeah. But luckily, but that's what I like about this band is the fact that, yes, some bands, I'm not a big fan of the term one hit wonder, but some are. Some got lucky once on one great song, which is more than the higher percentage of bands ever get, right? Most bands don't ever get past a first album, if you think about it. But Kansas have 2. And they don't sound anything like each other. They're completely different songs. So that's a pretty good microcosm of this is what you're in for. You're in for a little bit of everything.
And I was listening to that song today on my way back from work and heading home, getting ready for this. And I'm listening. I'm like, what a solo. What a solo. Just beautiful. Beautiful solo. And again, now this is going back to, I was just mentioning that there were times when maybe the label was saying, hey, we need a hit. This isn't the case. And I think that's something to be said here too, because it sounds natural. It doesn't sound contrived. It just came. And
go ahead.
That's the beauty of the track, I think. And the lyrics. I mean, everybody's coming into play here, obviously. You got Steve Walsh with his vocals. And did he write the lyrics?
No, it was all Kerry.
Okay.
And when you talk about contrived, an example of the band trying to write a hit single is the song "It Takes a Woman's Love to Make a Man" from The Mascot,
right?
Which I think is a really catchy song, but it doesn't. It sounds like any band of the era could have. It sounds like REO Speedwagon could have written it. It sounds like Nazareth could have written it, or I'm just throwing out names.
Yeah.
But when they were truly themselves, that's when they had their highest charting songs, and that's something I don't think a lot of record labels understand. But I will say this about Don Kirshner. I mean, apparently he took the bigger percentage of the publishing. That was the deal. but he was the only offer they had, and he had enough faith in them that he kept CBS, the wolf away from the door, saying, "I believe in these guys. Don't worry, you're going to get your money back. They're going to come through," and they did.
Yeah. So you have the two huge albums and the platinum selling live double album from 78, Two for the Show. And I would think most expected the next studio album to be another hit. 1979's
Yeah.
Monolith was not a hit. And you describe it as a dark, moody, challenging album. Was the band too experimental here?
I love that album so much, and I love the fact that the 70s, like, it was a different era. You'd sign these lengthy record deals, and the band, it would probably cheaper for the record label to put an album out than to say, no, we're not putting that out. And that's why you had bands like, and a lot of them were on CBS. You had bands like Blue Oyster Cult and Cheap Trick and Molly Hatchet, even Heart. They put out all these albums, and a lot of them weren't successful at all. But they have this, now you look back and they've got all of these different albums. And so for Kansas, coming off of those two multi-platinum albums, had the clout to present Monolith to the label. No obvious hit singles. And yeah, it is a dark, moody, challenging listen, and say, this is our album.
So none of the songs on this album people will recognize from the radio today. You had two singles, People of the South Wind, Reason to Be, songs that aren't recognizable.
People of the South Wind hit number 23 in its time, probably on momentum. It's the next thing they came out with. And I like the song, but I've never heard it on the radio ever, but obviously it was at one time. But yeah, there are no staples from that album. And you really see the difference a hit single makes. I mean, Left Overture sold 5 million over time. I think it probably sold, a 2 million in its time, but over time it's certified 5 million. Pointed Over Turns at 4 million. And Monolith, some say it went platinum. RIAA says no. So I'm guessing it's close, but that just shows you the drop off when you don't have that big single that's all over the radio that gets your average fans buying the album, not just the diehards.
And a really interesting question you ask in the book: how different would things be if Monolith was another smash hit? What do you think about that? And what did the panel tell you?
Well, my thought on that is that if you had another album that was at the level of Left Overture and Point No Return, another top 10, top 15 single, an across the board smash, if you were to do that a couple more times, I just think it would have cemented them as a major rock band, what we now call classic rock. And, a bit like a band like Styx that had like 5 or 6 albums in a row that each had at least one big hit off them, and they were all 2-3 million sellers consistently. If Kansas had been able to maintain that, I don't think they would have gone through the valleys of their career that they did. I just think they would have stayed a bigger band for longer. And but then again, maybe some of my favorite albums wouldn't have been made if that had happened. I don't know.
Was that the consensus among the guys on the panel? Did they all feel the same way?
Well, we all kind of agreed that the band always did what they wanted to do. It was just that the taste of the public, you just never know what people are going to latch onto. And so, the album came out, they went on tour, and it just didn't do as well. It was the first time they had an album that didn't do as well as what had come before. But the fact of the matter is that the first 3 albums, Monolith and Audio Visions, over time were all certified at least gold. So this is a band that sold a lot of albums, and it's not just the 2 big ones.
Yeah, Audio Visions came out the following year, 1980. Yeah, Tim Durling is the author of the new book, Let It Be Your Guy, the Kansas Album Review. The last album with the original lineup of Steve Walsh, Kerry Livgren, Robbie Steinhardt, Rich Williams, Dave Hope, and Phil Ehart until 2000, Somewhere to Elsewhere, is Audio Visions. A top 40 single, Hold On, comes off of this album. The song about Livgren's conversion to Christianity. Now, this is interesting because this is kind of where I think this is where Steve Walsh is starting to, there's a little bit of rift there between him and Livgren.
It started on Monolith, but I mean, that's only a year previous, right? So you had Kerry bringing his songs in, Steve bringing his songs in. There wasn't a lot of collaboration. They would basically bring in I'm assuming the greater part of a song. Maybe somebody would change a word here or there. But yeah, there were philosophical differences that were beginning to happen. And Hold On is ambiguous enough that, you would listen to it, it just sounds like a love ballad, which I think is why it got the airplay it did. But it is one of those funny songs. It's like, it's like Rainbow Stone Cold, or Burning for You by BOC literally hit number 40.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. And then Kansas returned to the top 20 with Play the Game Tonight from 1982's Vinyl Confession. That's a really solid song. Where have I heard that title before, by the way? Vinyl Confessions.
Well, it's absolutely the reason that I named my channel. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
such a big fan, and I thought Tim's Vinyl Confessions had a ring to it. So,
Love it.
10 years later, and I'm still doing it. So,
Yeah.
and I didn't know 10 years ago I'd be doing something like this. I mean, it just wasn't there to self-publish the way it is now. But
And
it
this,
plays
this,
surprises me that I don't hear it, because yeah, number 17 song is, that's pretty impressive considering how long they'd been around. At the time, they would have had that. Oh, that's an old band, right? Even though they were, maybe in their mid 30s at their oldest, but they'd been around for a while, and they managed a top 20 single. Unfortunately, the album didn't follow suit. It wasn't as successful, didn't certify, which is really strange to me. But yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic song. And what I think they did there was very, very wisely. They changed just enough of their sound that I've had this discussion, with a few people in the book, particularly Ches. We both think that there's that song and there's other songs in the Vinyl Confessions. We get like a Survivor vibe from it. So they were able to adapt ever so slightly to what was on rock radio at the time, and just hit that sweet spot in AOR where people just couldn't resist it. They made some they made some horrifically bad videos in their early career.
who didn't
But
in those
but
days?
but classic. I mean, not everybody can be Def Leppard. Not everybody can be Van Halen and be photogenic and ready to do these videos, right? But yeah, they're fun to watch now. But I can't imagine it driving album sales. But
I think you need a good pair of headphones to pick up on this. But Roger Taylor of Queen is in that song. He's doing backing vocals on that.
Right Away, which is the next song on Vinyl Confessions, you can hear him on that.
Oh, okay. So he's not on Play the Game Tonight, or is he?
He's not credited for it, but
Okay.
the one for sure that he could be, but I know for sure he's on the song Right Away, because you can hear him, and he could be on a song called Face It too that's on that album. But that's a fun little piece of trivia that I didn't know for a few years.
Yeah. How did Roger Taylor come into the picture?
Well, Kansas and Queen toured together very early on, like 74, 75. So they would have known each other for a long time. I don't know how Roger ended up, unless he was working on a solo album, because I think they recorded that in Georgia. But I could be wrong about that. But yeah, I mean, if you want somebody to sing high background vocals, who better than Roger Taylor?
Yeah, absolutely.
But on the album itself, it just said special thanks to Roger. It didn't say, probably contractually, they couldn't really make much of a, statement about who it was. But years later, I found this little book about Queen, and it said he sang background. And I put two and two together. Then I started kind of playing the songs in my head and go, oh yeah, I can hear him on there.
Yeah. Yeah. Now the lead vocals, not Steve Walsh, right? John Elefante.
Yeah.
He's the new singer at that time. He joins in 81.
Yeah, John was with the band for a short time. He was with them for Vinyl Confessions and the follow-up Drastic Measures. But when I got into Kansas, which wasn't until 1992, one of the first things I bought was their Best Of CD that came out in 84. And it's got 3 songs on it that feature John on lead vocals. The first one that I heard was Fight Fire with Fire, which I think is just a fantastic
Great
song. You'd never know it was Kansas. Again, they're changing, right? It's the 80s. But I love the song. So, I mean, that's right up my alley, right? So when I heard that, and I heard Play the Game Tonight, and then there was a new song on the original Best Of called Perfect Lover, I did not realize it was a different singer on those songs. He sounded so much like Steve Walsh. Now, as I got into the band and listened to them more and more, it's like, yeah, okay, it's a different tone, but he had a very similar vocal range. And one of the remarkable things about John is that it wasn't just they needed a singer. Carrie needed somebody that could write and could help carry the songwriting load. And he brought that. He and his brother Dino had been writing already, and they're a formidable songwriting team. So that was a pretty seamless transition as far as a band losing a lead vocalist, I think, when he joined.
Now, here's something I read in Wikipedia. You tell me if there's any truth to this. Sammy Hagar applied for the job. Have you heard this?
I don't believe that.
Yeah. Where do you think that came from?
Don't know. Wikipedia is public. I have never, that is the one and only place I've ever read that is on Wikipedia.
Yeah, because Sammy would have talked about that at some point.
You'd think. Sammy never refuses a microphone if somebody's
Sammy, yeah.
You know what I mean? I've also
exactly.
heard Doug King's X,
You've
which
heard
is
that? Wait, you heard that Sammy tried for King's X?
No, that Doug Pinnick tried for Kansas.
Wow. Okay.
And it's a strange comparison, but that whole thing, it's not a whole thing because nobody really talks about that much. But yeah, Sammy Hagar supposedly auditioning for Kansas just as his Geffen career is getting started and he's starting to sell records. I don't think so. That doesn't make any sense to me. Why would you go? Why would you do that? That would be a downward move. That's like Gene Simmons talking about Eddie Van Halen joining Kiss. I don't believe that either. Because the only person you've ever heard say that is Gene, right?
Right. Yeah. And David Lee Roth always thought that he was looking to steal Ed and Al.
But that was earlier. That
was earlier, yeah.
The album came out. So I could be, I certainly wasn't there. I just don't believe it.
Yeah.
I don't believe it. And I can't hear it either.
No.
Sammy's my favorite singers ever. I just can't hear him singing those Kansas songs. I can't hear it.
Yeah, right. Remember, he was considered for the Aerosmith gig when Joe Perry and Steven Tyler had a falling out.
Yeah, that was a weird period where the band is suing their own singer and yeah, Dysfunction Junction.
Classic Aerosmith, right? The drama.
Yeah. I just finished reading a book about them.
I am so bummed to hear about Steven Tyler, but props to him for saying, you know what, I can't do it anymore. I'm not going to go out there and sing to a track. So props to him. But what a voice, what a front man, what a presence on stage. I mean, just total rock and roll, Steven Tyler.
Absolutely. And I don't know when this is going to air, but possibly by the time this is aired, I will have aired our episode, sort of our Aerosmith tribute.
Cool.
But that figures in, and I don't really talk about it in this book because this book's about the music. They weren't really, Aerosmith had a reputation in the 70s of not being very good to their opening acts. Rush coming to mind, not getting any sound check. And they weren't very good to Kansas either. But those are stories out there for people to look up. Steven Tyler in particular being very, wanting, not wanting anybody to blow Aerosmith off the stage, which I don't know what they had to worry about because when they were the greatest, one of the greatest rock and roll bands ever. But especially when they played in Kansas home state, they had quite a following, right? And this is pre-Left Overture, and to the point where the road crew had to go out and do a dummy set of cables because Tyler would unplug stuff. So they wouldn't get any encores. So, I think things have since then because I've read just as many stories about people talking about how great Aerosmith were to tour with. So I think that they kind of mellowed over about that. But
things have changed. Yeah.
All of these, it doesn't take long. You talk about any of these bands, other bands come into the orbit, right? It's just how it is.
We mentioned Fight Fire with Fire. The album it comes off of, interesting title. This is 1983. Drastic Measures. You talk about drastic measures where, they took drastic measures here and tried something drastically different. And it pays off, though. Number 58 single, Fight Fire with Fire.
Number 3, Mainstream Rock. I mean, I don't understand how that song didn't get higher. I have to think CBS that was the last album of the contract. And I have to think they just weren't promoting it because it stalled at 41. It was the first time they didn't reach the top 40. With an album, and they spent some money on the video. The video makes no sense other than there's fire in it. But
I was just watching it today. Yeah. Yeah.
And all the band members are in it, right?
Yeah.
If you look closely enough, but it's very bizarre. Um, but yeah, that song could have been a huge hit. I say this a lot, but I think a lot of songs are like one soundtrack away from
I was just about
being
to see.
a board hit because that song
Imagine that shows
sounds,
up on like on a Rocky movie or something.
yeah,
You know,
yeah, or Top Gun, or yeah, it's a fantastic song. It's so of its time, but I don't care. I love it. Um, that
so
album,
you agree with the direction they were going. You agree with that?
see, I'm an '80s guy. I mean,
Yeah.
I love the fact when I listened to that best of CD, I thought it was great because I liked the progressive stuff. Like this is the first time I was hearing "Song for America" and "Point of No Return" and "No One Together" and "The Wall." Uh, but when I heard "Fight Fire with Fire," I'm like, this is so cool. I didn't know they had songs like this. I love this. It's variety to me. To me, it's versatility. It's not selling out. It's versatility.
Just changing with the times, and
Yeah.
uh,
And it paid off temporarily, but I mean, at the time, they've been around for 9 years. And you have to look at it. You can't look at it with 2024 perspective. You have to look at it as back then. That seemed like a long time for a rock band to be around. Like I remember, to give you another example, in the late 80s when the Rolling Stones came out with Steel Wheels. And people were talking about how old Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were. Well, they were in 1989. They're younger than I am now.
yeah, they're like
I
40.
don't feel that old. So it's just the perspective has changed, right?
Yeah,
Like,
the
they always
old
said,
the old man jokes applied to the Stones as far back as 78 when they hit the age of 30, or even
yeah,
maybe even Black and Blue in like mid 70s came around. I
yeah,
mean, that's just the
yeah,
way it,
nobody expected.
and here's what's interesting is I was just reading a great book on Live Aid, and I never realized the impact Live Aid had on bands like that because it made those bands cool again. Like Queen with Freddie Mercury, that performed. So
Well,
that
yeah.
changed a lot. I think that created the what we now know as legacy bands.
Well, that's where, I think a lot of people in my generation, if your parents didn't grow up listening to some of these older bands, maybe that's what when what's the first thing you think of when you think of, you mentioned Eric Clapton. First thing I ever heard from Eric Clapton, I think, was Forever Man.
Yes,
So
yeah, from
so
'85.
yeah, we can't just because it was big in the 60s and 70s doesn't mean you've ever heard of it. So a lot of people, when they think when's the first time you saw, Mick Jagger, it could have been, well, maybe it was the Undercover of the Night video, or maybe it was when Mick had what was it called, Just Another Night,
Yes,
or or maybe it was Dancing in the Street with Bowie.
yeah, we're around the same age. I love Undercover of the Night, and I remember mentioning that to a diehard longtime Stones fan, and I'm like, but I'm like, that's when I got on board. That's like I have memories of seeing that video on MTV, and the song I think
ZZ
kicks
Top.
ass.
That's a Eliminator. I didn't know they were an
Yeah,
old
yeah,
band.
right. Right. Or how about Stone's One Hit to the Body? I'm like, that song kicks ass, but the album Dirty Work was not the greatest, but
Yeah.
I admit, but yeah, it is interesting. It depends on when you jump on board to become a fan of the band. And if the band is around long enough, you're going to get new generations of fans. And a classic rock radio helped Kansas out a lot. I know they play what, 2-3 songs. I get that, but still, at least it helped them as far as some legitimacy there. It's like,
Yep.
okay, they're coming around, they're going to be playing in the area. I know those songs. So
Yep.
that certainly helped them. And you
You get
mentioned,
generations of fans, coming to shows. That's essential to any veteran band. And it's funny because one thing that, um, Supernatural, the TV show, Carry On Wayward Son was like the unofficial theme song. And actually that show featured a lot of great classic rock, Styx and Foreigner and Boston. But Wayward Son is the one. I mean, and the band themselves has acknowledged that. They've shown up at fan conventions. I mean, that's very smart. And it's the reason my kids knew that song as young as they did, because they watched that show. Eventually, I Am Who I Am, and they've seen all my CDs and my collection, but it legitimizes it. It's not like that's not just something that my dad listens to. That's something that's current. It's almost current, right? It brings these songs are evergreen and they'll last forever. And it's funny, the whole thing about Kansas, we're talking about 85, 86. My entry point with Kansas is when I heard All I Wanted on the radio in 1986. That was the very first time I'd ever heard of this band.
That's from Power. That's
Yeah,
from
that's a
1986.
very commercial
Yeah.
period. It's one of my favorite albums for that very reason. I think
Yeah.
that album is huge, but that's when I got on board.
Well, that's like the second half of Kansas because they put out the best of in '84, and
Yeah.
usually when you put out that best of, that's kind of a statement like, okay, hey, this, this is what we've done, and I think it's either the band is breaking up, and so here's our best of, take care, see you later, or we're going to move on to the next phase of our career,
Or the which record
or the record label company
label,
is.
yeah. I mean, you talk about Aerosmith. How many times did this happen with Aerosmith?
You're right.
Columbia put here's Classics Live and Chems,
So
and
true.
and then they signed back with Sony. Well, here's Geffen putting out. Yeah,
So true. Yeah, yeah, you're right.
I'm
Yeah, it's like you have one
without
more. Plus, if you want to get out of a record label deal and you got one more record left, it's like fine. Here's a best of. We're out.
yeah.
That's the other thing.
Yeah. Something I'm writing about right now, I won't name any names, but there's a classic example of that happening where someone put an album out and they didn't even really go out of the way to make it look like it was a best of. They made it look like it was a new album. More on that later.
Oh, okay.
But yeah,
Yeah, that
by
best of Kansas 84. So then, yeah, they come the next album after the best of is 1986's Power, and then In the Spirit of Things is 88. That was those are the last two studio albums of the 80s from Kansas. But
the last two
interesting
studio
lineup changes,
albums.
right? Steve
Yeah, they've got
Walsh.
Steve Morse on those albums, who's a monster player,
Steve
and
Walsh is back.
yeah,
So
Steve Walton comes back. So it's a yeah, and it's a little bit like Yes. I mean, after John Anderson left and they did the drama album, which is my favorite Yes album. But
really
then yeah,
interesting. I
I
just did an
love
episode
that.
on 90125 with Stephen
But I
Leonard.
love Nine. It's funny, this is all lining up because so then 90125 and Owner of Lonely Hearts, the first time I ever heard of Yes.
There you
I'd
go.
never out of
Right.
long distance run around when I was 9 years old listening to pop radio in the early 80s. But I think that Power, if MCA had promoted it correctly, I think Power could have done for Kansas what 90125 did for Yes and just completely revitalized them for a new generation of fans.
You
But
write that in
sadly,
the book. Yep. You put that in the book.
I still stand by that. I still think that album, they could have gone three, four singles deep with that album. It was perfect for the radio times. They revamped their image enough. I mean, the videos are pretty much of their time. They're better than the previous few they had done. But yeah, it just didn't happen. And then
MCA dropped the ball.
MCA totally dropped the ball because they dropped the ball with Kansas and they dropped the ball with a lot of other artists circa 1988. A lot of pressure was on the band for In the Spirit of Things. That's why there's 4 songs on there by outside writers, and they're not good songs. They're just even of the songwriters, because there's songwriters like Mark Spiro and Dan Huff and people that can write songs. They're just not the best of these writers. But 88, they are throwing these albums out, these old rock bands, in favor of Tiffany or Bobby Brown or whoever else was happening, right? Because the same fate befell Night Ranger. They put up Man in Motion, my favorite Night Ranger album. Love that album. Didn't do a thing on the charts. They did it to Dennis DeYoung. They did it to the Little River Band. They did it to Triumph. MCA was just not a good rock label. I've always thought it's a shame that Kansas couldn't have re-signed with CBS, because then they would have had that new push with the new music, but the back catalog would have been promoted too, because the record label would be like, hey, we stand to make more money, especially when CDs were just starting to come out, right?
Yeah.
It could have been, but hey. Yeah.
By the way, speaking of Night Ranger, by the way, this is funny. My friend was at an airport in Florida, and there was a woman sitting next to him, and she goes, do you recognize those guys over there? Do you know who that is? And he's like, no, I can't think. But you can tell they were like some older rocker dudes, long hair. She's like, that's Jack Blades from Night Ranger. And it was Jack Blades, and it was who else was there? I think the guitarist,
Gillis.
Brad Gillis. And so my friend went up very quickly, just introduced himself. He said they were like the coolest guys. Anyway, that's just an
I
aside.
met, yeah, I went to see them last year. They were fan. I'm a
Still
huge fan.
great. Yeah. Yeah.
Jack
But
and Kelly Pagey can still sing in the original keys. It's amazing.
yeah.
And we did a meet and greet. They were super cool. Jack Blades is a lot shorter than me.
Yeah.
You don't know until you meet people,
But
but
my friend was saying, like, just like a working band, just there at the airport, just getting ready to get on their flight, and they got their instruments with them and everything. And but we kind of going to what we were saying with Kansas, they got enough songs on the radio that you certainly beats the 9 to 5, that's for sure. And
yeah. And
Night
Steve
Range is a
Walsh
great
said
band.
something I think really prescient once, and not every band will admit to this. Some bands have a hard time admitting that, yeah, okay, we had, we made it once. But Steve Walsh said, Carrie wrote two amazing songs, Carrie on Wayward Son, Dust in the Wind. He said, that's my career. He said, those two songs have enabled us to weather all of these changes. So, I mean, he hasn't been in the band for quite a few years, but I thought that was really cool for him. He realizes that, yeah, if it weren't for those two songs, they wouldn't be able to make a living on the road.
And to me, and I know you agree, you go see the band because you know those two or three hits, but then you hear all the other songs in between that they're playing, all these classics. You're like, damn, this band is good. So you invest more into the band because it's not like there's just filler songs other than the hits. I mean, these are
But Steve,
legitimately solid rock and roll songs.
absolutely, and that's why I wanted to write this book, because I think Kansas deserves that brighter spotlight shone on them. Because I'm one of those crazy fans that would go to a concert and I'd be like, you know what? Doesn't matter to me if they play Carry On or Dust in the Wind or not. I'd rather them play Belexes or Stay Out of Trouble or Relentless, or these songs that most people don't, huh? They're the songs that you've seen it happen a million times. Band will do an obscure song and you've got like a very small percentage of the crowd losing their minds, and the
Yeah.
rest of people are like, oh, I'm
Yeah.
going to look at the merch booth.
But some
Um,
bands will do that for their hardcore fans. They'll put in a song or two.
Kansas, what I like about how they do things is they've never shied away from any point of their career. They're, like an easy example would be Deep Purple. I mean, you'll never have, with Ian Gillan on vocals, you'll never have them doing Burn or Stormbringer or anything from the
Oh,
Coverdale Hue. That
yeah.
just never happened. But the fans would love it, you
Speaking of
know?
Steve Morse.
Yeah, exactly. But Kansas, their last, I mean, the last two studio albums they've put out, they've followed each one up with a double live album, and they run the gamut from all aspects of their career. So it's really, it's I love this band too, but they're the anti-Journey. It's
Yeah.
not the predictable song list at all. There are a few songs you're going to hear. You don't necessarily know what order you're going to hear them in or what you'll hear in between, but you're going to come away from that thinking that was completely satisfying.
Yeah. This was a mind blow. Bob Ezrin. I had no idea he worked with Kansas. 1988, In the Spirit of Things. That album he produced, it tells a story of a flood hitting the real Kansas, a city called Neosho Falls, 1951. Isn't that the
Well,
backstory to this?
there's the backstory, but if anybody watches the deep dive series that I did on that album, that's actually my least favorite Kansas album. And when I say that, not everything can be your favorite. That happens to be my least favorite.
Well, what the
The
hell happened?
concept,
Bob Ezrin. I know
the
Bob
concept is
Ezrin was in a
very
period there though where he
wild.
had substance abuse issues. I don't know if this was
I think that he was still very much. It wasn't a focused thing because,
okay because we're talking about the guy who produced The Wall,
yeah, he also
Alice
produced The
Cooper.
Elder. Don't forget about that, and
I
that was a
know
big.
Music from the
Now
Elder was a similar situation.
I'm an Elder apologist, but in the spirit of things, gets started with a concept. It ends with a concept, but in the middle, it completely gets away from them. Like I said, they're doing these outside songs that have nothing to do with a town being flooded out. And it just seems like there was miscommunication everywhere. You've got a record company that's panicking, pushing for hits, and they're sandwiching them in between these other songs. And it
I mean,
doesn't necessarily sound like a Bob Ezrin production to me either. It's really
no,
weird.
but they also got Storm Thorgerson to do the album art. I mean, so they were MCA was I don't know, they're
And
pulling out all the stops here.
that album cover is invisible.
Yeah.
Can have their logo on it, which, like we said, is one of the best logos. I'm really down on that whole thing. Not the cover concept, but just the execution of it. It's dark. That album, I think, hit the delete bins within months of it coming out, sadly.
Yeah.
It
Plus,
does
those
have
hairband rock was huge, man. It was like
it's got some
Poison, White
songs on
Snake.
it yeah, it's got songs on it that I really like, but it's also got some songs where I go, why did they record this song? It's just they didn't write it. It's not that good. You could just I have this vision that somewhere there's an alternate version of that album that they had wanted to do that was more like traditional Kansas. But you're right. I've said this many times. I've said it about Night Ranger. I've said it about Survivor. I've said it about Foreigner. I've said it about REO Speedwagon. For these bands, 38 Special, it wasn't their time anymore.
Yeah.
Late 80s was not the time for these bands, because it was Bon Jovi and Def Leppard and Whitesnake, bands that I think in many cases were influenced by a lot of these late 70s bands that lasted into the 80s and don't get the credit for it. But yeah, it was unlikely that anything Kansas put out in 1988 was going to be a hit. But I think that they might have been able to put out a better album with some more focus. I wish they'd have gone back to working with Jeff Glicksman sooner than they actually did. Jeff Glicksman produced most of their albums in the 70s, and he understood this band. He grew up with these guys. He knew, he became a well-known producer because of them.
He did come back later, though, didn't he? Produce a later album?
Yeah, he produced Freaks of Nature, which that was their first
95.
independent album, and it's one of my all-time favorites. I think it's a great album. I think it's a great sounding album, and it sounds like Kansas, but it sounds like Kansas revitalized for the 90s. It's heavier.
Yeah. Yeah, let's get to that one a little bit. Yeah,
that's an album that I think
they
people
had
would be
I was gonna say
surprised.
they had a compilation album in 92, Carry On. Then they had Live at the Whiskey in 92. Then there's a box set in 94, and then comes Freak of Nature.
Yeah, Freaks of Nature unfortunately came on this little label called Intersound, which is out of Atlanta, and it didn't have the distribution. I had to special order it, but I knew it was coming out. It's one
Quite
of
a
my
cover,
favorites.
huh?
Yeah.
Is that let's see, is that a real like a
That's one of
streak
those.
or...
I was told that came from an old magazine advertisement from like the 1920s or something.
Yeah.
Um, I'm not sure what it is actually supposed to be, but I think people would be surprised listening to that album, just how vital it sounds. And I
And they
think
brought the logo back, the old Kansas logo.
yes. And I love how there's a different like creature or animal hidden in each letter.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
There's a lot of great imagery on there. I love that album. I was way into that when it came out.
Yeah. Yeah, and just because something doesn't do well commercially doesn't really mean that much when you get to the mid 90s, because
right,
now grunge, you got, you could get a kick-ass album, it's just not going to get any airplay. Radio stations weren't going to bother, regardless of how good it was. But that's one you say people should check out. I think that one is available on Spotify, because I believe, let's see.
Yeah, and it was reissued on vinyl a few years ago because it had never been on vinyl originally. Unfortunately, it's not the best transfer I've ever seen. It's pretty blurry front and back photo. It looks like they just took the CD cover and blew it up, because it never would have been made for vinyl originally, right?
Yeah.
Well,
these are the two I picked out for the playlist for the episode, but you tell me if I should add more. Desperate Times and Hope, once again, I picked those two.
If you want to pick out something heavy, Black Fathom 4.
Black Fathom 4. That's off that
song.
album.
That song there is the closest I think Kansas have ever come to metal.
Okay, here it is. I'm adding it as we speak here, Tim. Here we go. Let's put it right up there. So 3 tracks now from that album. Yeah. And I love the next one, which is the album they do with the London Symphony Orchestra. And it's from 1998, Always Never the Same. Let's see, that's the title, right? Always Never the
Same. Yeah. It had a lot of it's reworkings of older songs, but they did do I think 3 new studio tracks on there and a cover of Eleanor Rigby.
Yeah. So a nice version of Dust in the Wind, man. Really nice version of Dust in the Wind.
I mean, the music, there were a lot of trends, right? There was the Unplugged album. There was the covers album. Well, one of them was the orchestral album, but Kansas music lends itself to that more than a lot of bands would. So actually, that's not even, I didn't even consider that an album in the book, to be quite honest with you, because it only had the four new songs on it, one of which was a Beatles cover. So I kind of talk about those in the chapter on the next album, which is Somewhere to Elsewhere, which is another album that came and went and didn't get any attention, even though I think it's quite good.
The year
And there's
2000 that came.
behind that too.
What's up?
The special circumstances behind that one too, because for once you've got the original six lineup together, plus Billy Greer still staying there on bass. So you had two
That's
bass
right.
players. That Kerry Livgren wrote all the songs on it, and then he was gone again. But in the meantime, and that was their last studio album for 16 long years.
Right, I know. Yeah, that was the first with the band's original lineup since 1980's Audio Visions.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was in 2000. Yeah, another 16 years before another Kansas album arrived, but this would not be with the original lineup. Who's on the 2016 album? The Prelude Implicit.
Yeah, the Prelude Implicit and the Absence of Presence from 2020 are both about as good new albums by a veteran band as I can think of. Just really, I think that the Absence of Presence is even better than the Prelude Implicit. You've got Ronnie Platt on vocals. He joined, I think Steve Walsh finally stepped down from Kansas in 2015. He just did not want to do any new Kansas music. He was making his own music, but for some reason he didn't want to do any new Kansas material. So they were just out on the road and playing the oldies. But Ronnie came from a band called Shooting Star, which some people will have known. He wasn't in their 70s 80s lineup, but he had been previously their singer, and I'm sure there's some other bands that come to mind that he was in. In fact, there's one that's evading me right now, but he doesn't sound like Steve Walsh and he doesn't sound like John Elephant, but he's got the right set of pipes for this material, and he can handle anything, whether it's from Monolith or whether it's from Power or whether it's from one of the albums he actually sang on. So I think this band's future, I think they've got more new music in them.
Yeah, I thought that'd be great. The Prelude Implicit, The Voyage of 818 is my favorite.
It's great. It's fantastic.
That's a great song. And then on the absence of presence, right? So there are three singles which are all solid: Throwing Mountains, Jets Overhead, Memories Down the Lane.
Yeah, Memories Down the Line, great ballad.
Oh, I'm sorry, Memories Down the Line. Yes.
But yeah, Throwing Mountains is a good heavy, like a heavy Kansas one. Animals on the Roof is another favorite of mine on there. I think that's just a killer album from start to finish.
And that's July of 2020, not too long ago, but 4 years just after COVID, right? The Absence of Presence.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tom Brislin on keyboards. That's the first album he's on. Yeah. And the last to feature David Ragsdale.
Yeah, David Ragsdale since stepped down, which is a shame. I liked his playing. He was a really good replacement for Robbie Steinhardt, because Kansas went about 10 years without that violin, without that, their life force, what they were known for. I'm guessing that they just played those parts on synth, I guess, the violin parts. But Ragsdale came into the band in the early 90s, and Freaks of Nature was the first band he was on. He also plays really good guitar. But he's since been replaced by a guy named Joe Dennison, who was in a band called Stratovarius. Not familiar with him, but Kansas never hires bad musicians. So I think they're going to be all right.
And they celebrated the 50th anniversary in 2023, currently on tour, the 50th anniversary tour, right? Still going.
Yeah, they're still on tour. They're road dogs, man. They play pretty big theaters and big size venues. And unfortunately, we've had this conversation before. They never seem to come around the eastern part of Canada, which is where I've only ever seen Kansas once. I saw them in '94 when they played in a little place in Maine, which is just across the border from where I live.
Yeah, check out what's their official website. People can check for those dates.
It's kansasband.com.
Yeah, kansasband.com. You're right. Yep. Now, last question. Doing a quick Google search. If you search Kansas Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, there's a post on Reddit with a heading, "How the hell are Kansas not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame?" That's one of the first entries when you do a Google search. So I know you feel they should be in there. Why are they not in there? And do you think that will ever change?
Well, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I mean, it doesn't mean much when they're inducting pop artists and hip hop artists and country artists that don't even want to be inducted.
Whitney
Uh,
Houston, man,
yeah.
rock and roll.
Look, I think there should be a pop Hall of Fame. I think there should be a hip hop Hall of Fame. But
Yeah.
you know, why is it that we're all right with inducting hip hop artists into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, yet you try to induct some, in a hip hop, well, it might happen now with all the crossovers, but into the Grand Ole Opry, that
Yeah.
wouldn't happen.
And they
So
have
why is
something
it okay?
against these progressive rock bands. It's like they're just
They seem to. I know things started to open up, but they're also backwards about it because even though I've been a Rush fan and I'm a bigger fan longer than I've been a Yes fan, it doesn't make sense that Rush got in first because if it wasn't for Yes, there wouldn't be Rush.
right.
They
But
do things backwards when
the
they do the
explanation to that would be that once they get a band in, that band now has a
that it
say
has
or a vote.
a little bit of say, yeah, which is good. Um, I think this kind of goes back to my why if they'd have had two more albums that were as big as Leftover to Your Point of No Return, that might have made a difference. But I mean, when you think about bands that aren't in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame yet, Boston aren't in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I mean, if Boston had only put out that one album, it should still be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Had the record for
That
the biggest selling debut album of all time.
that company isn't in the Rock and Roll Hall
Oh,
of Fame
Bad
for sure.
Company. Ugh, don't get me
So,
started. I love Bad Company. They should
Kansas,
be.
Kansas have, I mean, I my feeling is I just don't think that they were a major band long enough. I think they're deserving of every accolade because they're fantastic. My goal, I've always said that to me, when you think about the classic rock bands of the 70s, you think about Zeppelin and Queen, and these great, great, great bands. To me, Kansas is every bit as good, and their catalog is every bit as consistently good. It's just that, a lot of different lineup changes, different labels, major labels, minor labels, all these different things that just create this confusion where people, stop up and go, yeah, but past Carry On Wayward Son and Dust in the Wind, what did they do? And you need somebody like me or any of the people in this book to sit them down. This is what they did,
Right.
you
And
know?
how many bands can say that they incorporate the violin into rock and roll and make it work and create iconic songs that last that will last beyond us. And if you want to
Yeah.
go with that whole theory of, well, they only got a couple big selling albums, maybe they should have had more. Def Leppard is one of my top 5 favorite bands of all time. But if you want to go with that argument, okay, well, Def Leppard had two big albums, Pyromania and Hysteria.
Well, yeah, but the difference
Am
is
I
is that also had multiple hit singles from those
right?
albums.
Right. No, trust me, I
So,
am.
oh yeah,
I
same
love
here.
Def Leppard. I'm saying
I
like this
get
whole form. That's what. There's no formula there. It's like all politics. I think it's just
yeah, and there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason. And also, Kansas was never a band that, for some reason, they were never a band that was given the lip service by other bands saying, "Hey, this band is cool. I grew up listening to
right.
this band. You too." I got into Queen a lot because Metallica talked about them, Extreme talked about them, Def Leppard talked about them. Kansas deserved that. You know, the documentary is great. The documentary is great because Brian May is in it and he speaks very highly of them. But
Oh,
he would have
that's
been
cool. Yeah, I
yeah,
didn't know.
he would have been a peer of theirs, right? They started around the same time. But the younger bands, and I say the younger bands, the next generation of bands, you never heard them talk about Kansas. So I think that has something to do with it too.
Bottom line is, look, listen to the music. If you love the music, that's all that matters. So,
Exactly.
who cares?
Exactly.
And the fact that they're still out there 50 years later and they're still drawing good crowds, that says it all. The music's going to be there. So that's what I say. Damn it. I'm
But
preaching to
no,
the
I
choir
agree
here.
with you. I just think they need to come up in that classic rock conversation more than they do.
Yep. Yep. Well, your book is definitely gonna help. Let It Be Your Guide, the Kansas album review. There it is. It's out now. You can find it wherever books are sold.
You can
And
find it on
Tim,
Amazon, wherever your local Amazon
yep,
is. That's
yep.
and you'll have it within 2 or 3 days.
And where can people find you online? Tell us about your YouTube show.
Well, if you go to timsvinylconfessions.com, that immediately brings up my YouTube channel. And I'm approaching my 10th year. It'll be at the end of this month. It'll be 10 years since I've been doing this, and I met a lot of cool people along the way, yourself included, and met a lot of fans of bands that I thought I was the only fan of. And that eventually led to me, being on my third book, actually working on my fourth. But
And we can't say what that fourth book is about.
we don't want to say that right now.
I may or may not know what it's about, but I'll zip the lip. But yeah, man, congrats on all the great work, and the work you do for these bands that deserve the accolades and the attention.
Thank you.